are Paul McKay with the Four, bringing occupiers of space and their decision makers strategies to handle and deal and optimize your commercial real estate. Have Chris James with us today. Really excited for the content he's gonna bring. Welcome, Chris. And wanted to ask you some of the stuff you guys have been working on as it relates to analyzing and helping occupiers of space understand utilization trends of commercial real estate, where they were, where they're at, and you've got some very tangible and some very well thought out strategies on how groups can optimize utilization while also maintaining a competitive cost per full-time employee, which is I think what everyone really wants to hear right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right? I think every major company and especially the occupiers we're dealing with, they're running at some kind of KPI against cost savings for real estate, more intuitively now than they ever have. And it's a big shift because we've seen so much happen since the pandemic. And it's funny, I actually joke because the reason I was interested in commercial real estate, back in 2008 when I started as a broker in Calgary, I always just thought like everyone's going to need office space. And so if I can get into office space, I can, probably be a guy that's relevant 50 years from now and, might look a little different, but we're all going to go to an office. And then enter 2020. And now everyone's questioning, how bad do we need office space? And I think that the truth is that we do need it. I think about how much I learned being in the office, with the Cressa team.
Yeah.
Just hearing them on the phone and in the meetings and talking to each other and, being on those tours and seeing those things in real time. It's really important that we do have a place that we can go and be together. It's just that the way that we look at it today is fundamentally different. And, we watched as prop tech started to come up in a mad rush coming out of the pandemic and all these really interesting point solutions that are very valuable. But, we talk about it as like, they're all parts of a bike. And landlords adapted quite quickly, grabbing these things. And so they were buying these parts of the bike. And I always think it's a funny thing to look at, like all these landlords walking around with like some wheels and some handlebars. Someone came along and said, hey, you want to ride a bike? Here's some handlebars. You need these handlebars to ride a bike. So they buy the handlebars. But we never really had like the frame that put it all together, that attached the parts to it. And so, we were really trying to understand why is all this important? Why is this data important? Why are these solutions important? And so we started to really process this from like old world versus new world. So what were the big things that were shifting? And we settled on these points when we looked at the old world. One thing that we did know in the old world is that all occupiers behave similarly. So what that meant to us was like, if you were a tenant in the market, you were planning for space that you were going to use Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, or whatever your business hours were. And everyone behaved in that similar way. There was maybe, I think, a few engineer groups I remember back in the day that in the summertime had Friday off, but that was just like an incentive that they were giving to their engineers, or, there were those little things. But traditionally, we occupied space Monday to Friday. And that shift that we're going to go through, that's going to be the main thing we'll talk about. But it's different today. We don't do Monday to Friday. And we'll see how meaningful that is when you even just take away one day of occupancy, how meaningful that is from a utilization standpoint. So we were really starting to think, okay, how are we using space today? And then we started to look at the building level. So you looked at like buildings historically benchmarked against their competitors. So we always saw like A class win against A class. So, these buildings, this was the comp set. You didn't look at an A class building and a C class building. You always benchmarked against who you're competing with. Whereas today, what buildings are being forced to do is benchmark against capabilities. And what we're going to find as we start to look at some graphs is that it means that buildings that can't create these capabilities that are relevant and important, well, what do we do with them? And that's when you start to have the conversation around adaptive use. Because it's not necessarily about the A class versus B class versus C class. It's now about, this is what I need inside the building. This is the kit of parts I need so that I can run my space. And if you can't deliver those capabilities, well, then I got to look at a different building.
I don't want wheels as a tenant. I want a bicycle.
Yeah, exactly. I want the full bike. It's great, the wheels here, but I need something that can give me the full bike. And when you start to look at capabilities and different products, then you have to look at the way we are transacting. And so transactions in the past were concession based. And so we'd come in and we'd negotiate a term, and then we'd negotiate a TI and a free rent and a fixturing period, and where we could spend the TI, and all these different things that went into the way the transaction was built. Well, if we're focusing on capabilities and we're focused on the bike, we have to start to look at the data. And so transactions are going to be driven from the data that we understand about how we utilize space. So what products we need so that we can be effective. We saw the other big change we saw was in the deal cycle. I mean, we are traditionally a 5, 7, 10-year lease, depending on what market you're in. And I'll show you, we're not saying that that's going away, because the truth is conventional leasing is still the best way to procure space. Yeah. It's the fastest, it's the most effective, it's the most cost savings. But what we're going to see is that in lockstep with conventional leasing is going to be some kind of hybrid transactions where there's going to be a shorter deal cycle. There's going to be some more frequent turn. It's not every deal. Not every deal should be flex, but we are going to see a change in the length of term.
You've used data to come up with strategies that solve the problems that we're facing now. It wasn't a hypothesis that you say, this is how we think people want to act. You've actually used utilization data and broken it into like financial metrics and saying, this is how people want to act, but also this solves the problems of how you analyze what's best for the organization, both from accommodating the space that's required, the bicycle, but also being able to afford the bicycle, making the bicycle kind of the best financial model to use.
There's full bicycles that are quite expensive, but that doesn't mean that it's the best bike for the occupier, for the rider.
Right.
And so we try to use the data to say, this is the best combination of parts that will give you the most cost savings. And, not to kill the punchline, but we're finding that we can save about 35% on tenants' costs just by looking at transactions through data. Yeah. And the interesting thing about, I'll say this note, the evolution of prop tech was so fast that we almost immediately jumped into these solution-oriented products, these like customer-facing products. Whereas if you look at the tech life cycle of other industries, there's always these data-driven products that come first. So the first thing you do is you pull the data around what the industry is, and then it transitions into these service-oriented products over time. We kind of skipped that part where we just like jumped over the data and then went to these solutions. And now we're kind of taking a step back, being like, oh, we actually should figure out how these point solutions can drive some of the data that we're trying to understand. So we'll show you some of that. But a lot of that comes from this idea that historically we would, survey tenants, when you're working with a large occupier, you survey the employees and figure out what they want, and where they want to be and what works with transit, and you look at where they live. Today, that stuff's really important. But the other thing we're going to look at and that we have to dive deep into is real-time data and analytics around how we're using our space, because that's something that historically was ignored. But today it's really, really important. And you're going to see why when we look at some of our demand curves. And so this is kind of our first pass at what this looked like to us. And I'll show you, I'll do a little annotating on here. It's not going to be the best because I'm on, got a little pad here, but if you take anyone who's been in any kind of real estate market, they've at some point looked at like an occupancy graph.
Yeah.
And an occupancy graph historically looks like this. This is going to be my great artwork. Okay. So this is what it looked like. Yeah. Some of us call it just the heartbeat graph. Yeah. But prior to pandemic, it probably looked like this. So if this was your Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, everyone came in and then they left, and then they came in and then they left. It doesn't really tell a story that's that meaningful to us, because all it shows is that on any given day, someone comes into the office and someone leaves. But we knew that there was something inside that data that could help us understand some of the trends that were changing as pandemic came into place. And so the first thing we did was we looked at this occupancy data, but instead of doing it as January to December, we stack ranked it. And we stack ranked it based off of high days and low days. And so if you look at the graph that's in front of us on the screen right now, down here, all you see is this is your work days in a year. So let's say there's 245 work days in a year. And again, this isn't necessarily January 1st and December 31st. This is likely your lowest occupancy day of the year, which is maybe this first 7 days is Stampede week, right? No one's in the office. It's low utilization. And then over here maybe is like the day after Labor Day when everyone's coming in. It's like, we got a few months left where let's kill it. And they're all fired up. Okay. So this is your low day and your high day.
For those of you listening outside of Calgary, Stampede is our annual local rodeo, which is quite the event.
Yeah. Everyone's out of the office having fun and no one's working. And so the Y right here is percentage of space. You could have this as a square footage number. We have it as a percentage number because it helps paint the picture for market. And so then the red line right here is going to be everything below the red line is going to be your lease space.
Yeah.
The yellow right here, this is obviously your traditional market vacancy that exists. So this is all your lease space. So this is what everyone's paying on. The blue line is the way that we were using it before pandemic. And so if this represented 100,000 square feet, our low days, we were using about 60% of that. On our high days, we were using about 75% of that. And then everything that's in red right here is our underutilization. So space we're paying on, but we're not using.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what this represents is a healthy commercial real estate market prior to pandemic. Monday to Friday usage, everyone understood that I'm never going to use 100% of my office space, but I'm probably going to use it between 60 and 70% of the time, and I'm okay with that. And this is the way that we ran at procuring space. We would figure out how many employees they had on their peak days, account for a little bit of growth. We would understand that space is never going to be 100% utilized, and then we would lease space and procure it to whatever this line was. And it was a really good way for us to run at transactions. Now, what we would see in any kind of downturn, I witnessed the '08 one, and anytime there's a slowdown in any market, this is what we would do, and it was acceptable. We would realize, well, we don't need this many employees, and so our employee count would go down. And so you see the drop in the blue line from the dotted line where it was before. And because we don't have as many employees, we now don't need as much space. And so the amount of space that's leased in the market drops. So our overall market vacancy increases. Our demand usage drops because we have less employees. But because we decrease our footprint, our underutilization of space stays the same. So we're still using space at 60, 70% of the time. It's just we're using less space because we have less employees.
Yep.
And so we're still procuring the space the same way. We're still using it the same way, and it's easy and manageable.
The per diem is the same. It's just how much space they're taking.
Exactly. And this was, we use data from about 400 different large occupiers in North America. Yeah. And this is what we consistently saw was this demand curve shape, this type of utilization, and this was the standard market norm. Now, when we were able to understand that, we then dug into it a little bit more. Well, if that's what we were historically used to in shifts, what happened in the pandemic that was fundamentally different? Mm-hmm. And the thing that we noticed that was significantly different in this recession or downturn or whatever you want to call it was that for the first time in history, the shape of our demand curve changed. So our distance between our low day, when we have the least amount of people in the office, versus our high day is now significant. And on top of that, the amount of peak days that we have is only about 10% of the time, 15% of the time. And so what are we managing for now? Well, we looked at this before. Before, what we would do is just say, oh, well, we'll just procure space here because that's what we're used to. We'll just bring space down. And under this demand curve line, that would have been acceptable. But now our underutilization of space based off our average occupancy shifts significantly. We can no longer achieve 60 to 70% utilization procuring space in a conventional way. It's not possible. Anytime we ran data and analytics on this, even if you remove one work day out of the week, this demand curve shifts significantly. So let alone take away 2 or 3 days or more, you are going to have these major shifts. And this is the number one problem that occupiers are running at right now, because they can't figure out how to get back to that peak utilization that they're used to, where they know that I'm underutilizing my space by 30%, but that's okay. Now it's, they're using it at 30, 40% most of the time, just because they have to account for these peak days.
We had a call with a group yesterday, and they're at 10, 15% utilization, they estimated.
Right?
But,
and 10, 15%, probably like 80% of the year. And then they probably have some days where they're at 60 and they're like,
yeah, how do we do this? Yeah.
And so this is where it gets really interesting. And this is where we start to talk about this theory that before we ran at Flex as this like future of leasing. And I was head of real estate for Notel. And that was the way, like, the future is Flex. Yeah. Everyone's going to want Flex space. And so we then have to shift our thinking and say, okay, no, this is about how does Flex make conventional leasing the most effective? And so when we reran these demand curves and we looked at it in kind of the future set, we were able to see, prior to running any kind of data, that, well, look, if we can procure space that gets us to our utilization of 60 to 70% most of the time, and we can use this as conventional leasing still, and this kind of solves for everything under the red line up until what we call burst capacity days. Well, as long as this can get into that 60 to 70% utilization, then we're good. And then all we got to do is account for this, our what we call burst capacity days. Now, if there's on-demand space that exists in the building, which most good buildings should have some kind of flex space today, we can now leverage this on-demand space as needed. And this is a true hybrid transaction. So then what ends up happening, and this is where the conversation can get bigger, is you have a decreased footprint on a conventional way, but your utilization remains the same. You're leveraging the products that exist within the building, because remember, we're now going against building capabilities, not against asset types. So you're now leveraging the capabilities that exist within the building. And now you have the whole bicycle. You have everything you need so that you can run your business. And that could run you a 35% cost savings in your overall cost. Now, what happens is your market vacancy is going to stay the same, because you just have like buildings that just are going to remain at, 85, 90% leased. But then you're going to have a whole bunch of buildings that just aren't going to be able to deliver this and aren't going to be relevant. And that's when you start to talk about adaptive reuse. So, what those buildings are is not what we're trying to solve for today. But this is a good visual as to what's happening, how the shift has changed the way we look at real estate, how Flex is going to play into making conventional leasing effective, how market vacancy is going to traditionally shift, and how some buildings are just going to fall out because they just don't have the capabilities to deliver the products that are necessary.
And the common theme is everyone says it's a flight to quality. It's not necessarily a flight to quality. It's a flight to the buildings that have the capacity to give you the bike that you need, which generally are the nicer, newer buildings where the landlords have spent money amenitizing them, or they're buildings that are older that have been recapitalized with new common area amenities that also have, the parts of the facilities and the amenities that kind of help tenants meet this demand curve.
Yeah. And credit to Kevin Seelig for this one, but we call it's no longer flight to quality. It's flight to capabilities.
Flight to capabilities. I like it. I've not been a big fan of the flight to quality. I think that's just human nature. People want nicer things. It's a flight to what makes more sense, and capabilities is a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan. We used to be under a program of, doing transactions that help people find space, but now it seems the proper strategy for most groups is to properly design your space and use data and trends on when people want to come in and how they want to utilize space. And this analogy fits into where tenants should be strategizing before they even get out to understand, square footage and where they want to be. Understanding how they're going to operate and how this model works is usually step one.
Yeah. And that's kind of where we get involved. We come in kind of day one, and a lot of this data that we need to run these models, it already exists through swipe card data, or some buildings even have occupancy sensors, but we're able to come in and use, once we get the utilization and the data, we can run a variety of models. I mean, for most of our occupiers, we're running 100 to 150 scenarios of, what their footprint should be, and, how much flex that they should look for inside the portfolio that they're going to. And, we have clients that we've run the models for, showed them the game plan, handed the playbook to the broker, and even gone as far as saying, hey, landlord XYZ in your market can actually deliver this. And so I'll save you the, 20 site tours and the walking around, the sweating in the sun.
Yeah.
And you should call them, because guess what? They have buildings in this market, and you're going to run the same game plan in Chicago and Vancouver and Seattle and LA. And they have buildings there too, and they'll do the same thing. And so that's where transactions become more win-win, because, it's not about throwing buns at each other over how much TI you should get. It becomes a very streamlined conversation around, hey, we have X amount of burst capacity days. We need shared facilities for A, B, C, and D, and we need X amount in conventional leasing. So let's just get to it.
I love it. I think if this isn't of interest to somebody, they definitely need to look at how this is operating. Maybe we'll go through this last slide here, and then I'd love to have you back on and give kind of some walk through some case studies of some stuff you guys would have on another episode.
Yeah, we'd love to come on and talk more about the modeling, even kind of what the agent-based modeling strategy that we use to kind of get this down to a science. But the closing note here is, this is the same graph. The red or the pink still represents your underutilization, which on a conventional lease base keeps you between 60 and 70%. The light green there is the flex burst capacity days that you're striving to just have an as-need basis. And then all your cost savings exists in that dark green, because you're no longer paying for that conventional space that you had to procure long-term so that you can manage those burst capacities. And so the round numbers, and we have case studies to show these savings, is if you did a conventional deal under the old way that we procured space, it's about $700-800 per FTE, which is traditional. If you went all flex space,
full-time employee.
Full-time employee, yeah. And then if you went all flex under the same model, it would be $10,000 per full-time employee. However, if you run it this strategy using our analytics and our modeling, then and you do execute a true hybrid transaction under these terms, your FTE costs go down to $5,100. So these are the cost savings that we can achieve when we understand the data. And this is why, we kind of say, let's take a big step back. Let's understand these things. And then we know what products to build inside buildings.
Start the process early, get the data you need, set the plan, and then you've got somewhere to start, which is kind of, one of the things we're preaching the most to most groups is not starting early enough is a decision. It's a decision for indecision. And then you don't have the ability to execute with this level of precision.
Yeah. I mean, I think I read in the news, the Minecraft deal took 2 years. In San Francisco, the deals shouldn't take 2 years. Yeah,
100%. Well, I really appreciate it. We're going to have you back on. I think this is some of the best stuff we've seen for intellectual capital that's in the industry these days. It's something everyone should be talking about. And really excited to share this with the groups that are looking for some guidance on how you work through the process of understanding this model. I think you guys have cracked the code and are definitely a good advisor to have on helping set the workplace design for groups.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. We're excited to work with occupiers and brokers and landlords. And, I think this puts us in the right direction of understanding what the future looks like.
Awesome. Well, thanks. We'll have you on again and really appreciate everything.
Thanks, Paul.